Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Skylar with Lean Frontiers. On our screen, you can see Cheryl. Just a quick reminder, we do have a early bird discount going on right now with Lean Frontiers for the TWI and Kata Summit. It is good until the 31st, so I believe the 31st is Friday. And Cheryl, they are still logging in, but I believe you are good to go whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Just making sure we got all right. Our topic, I'm so excited to be here today. This is becoming my favorite topic. I think throughout my 30 years of doing continuous improvement, it's been an evolution. So I guess I should start with an introduction. My name is Cheryl Jekiel, and I own the Lean Leadership Center. And I'm out of the Chicagoland area. And I spent over 30 years doing continuous improvement in corporate America in specific different kinds of jobs. I have a particular background in lean HR. That was my original area of expertise. But the work we're going to be talking about today has actually been a lot of the learnings in the last 5 to 10 years. And I want to share some things I've been seeing. But I would say, one way I think about this, I've gotten too cranky to do it, to not let it stick anymore. So continuous improvement has always been a challenge in terms of sustainability. I have spent the last several years really focusing on nothing else other than that one question. I continually spend time with organizations with 10, 15 years of continuous improvement or lean or operational excellence type initiatives or processes, and they don't sustain. So we're going to be talking today about what drives that. And the good news is I've been seeing several things help. I'm going to relay those on to you today. So hopefully for the time you put in, you're going to get some maybe new ideas about how we might think about this topic of sustainability. Because if I don't like wasting my time and energy, I'm sure none of you do either. So hopefully you're here on the quest of sustainability. So here's our agenda. We're going to start with the problem, which is why improvements efforts fade or don't last. We hate to say the word fail. One way to think about it is they may fade out. We're going to be talking about the use of systems thinking for lean transformations. That was a big shift for me in taking concepts I knew from one place and applying them to lean transformations. So I'm going to go through those ideas and applications, and you can try those on for yourself. Then we're going to go through 4 stages of social change, which is a systems methodology applied to continuous improvement. And then we're going to be ending with some of my particular work in core leadership and how that develops plans for sustainability. The goal is by the time we're done today, you've had maybe several ideas thrown your way, and you've been able to find some like, that's a good next step for me. You'll have access to the slides. I'll mention things you could also access. So my goal today is give you plenty for being here and hopefully some ideas of where to get more resources. So I never know who's in the audience. So for many of you, this is probably not a new idea, but I want to make sure for anybody watching this, what we're going to be talking about today roots to a concept that came into my life called lean transformations. Many organizations, even if they're aware of this term, might not use that word. So whether you're putting in the most common thing I'm hearing later, operating systems. So you might have company name operating system. You might have operational excellence, whether you call it lean, Six Sigma, doesn't really matter. It's in this transformational environment, in that genre,
Cheryl,
based upon.
real quick, we can't see your slides.
Oh, boy, I'm so sorry about that. Here we go. Are they sharing?
Yep.
I didn't know that.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Boy, thank you, Skylar. So this was the agenda. So I guess we're all on the same page with the agenda. First slide is that we're talking about lean transformations. I have a definition up here. And as I mentioned, you could be using this from any type of terminology, but the essence of it is it's a different way of how an organization works. It's rooted in new behaviors, a different style of leadership, and it's all about continuous improvement and customer value. So it's not whether we all have the same definition, but this is kind of a starting place of letting you know the topic of sustainability can apply to any initiative. And I have to tell you, everything we're discussing today, I've seen to have application on almost any strategy implementation of any kind. Because the same thing in continuous improvement of, let's say, we're putting in problem solving efforts or a way that we're going to balance workloads or things like that. It's always going to still come down to we want to make a change in behaviors and we need that change to hold up. So while this is the context, and actually we're taking work that comes from other contexts and we're applying it to continuous improvement, the same ideas will apply to anything you apply them to. In terms of why am I interested in this? Why, after all these years, is this still the only thing I really care about? When I was about 26 years old, I was part of a successful lean transformation. By then, I was fairly early in my career coming out of college, and I worked in a plant that made paper plates and straws. And it was kind of dark and dingy. It was a couple thousand people. And I noticed the work seemed very monotonous to me. People had very kind of jobs like they packed cups all day or worked on equipment all day. And I remember just thinking this must be a hard way for people to make a living. And we had a lot of people who'd been there for decades. And in that process, I saw this complete, they came in and we were losing money badly. And there was a range of issues going on with the people, but they were still mostly, head down doing their work. In the transformation, it was a complete shift in how leaders led and how much they unleashed really the talents and capabilities of the team. So we had 2,000 problem solvers, the real deal. We got to see really an entire workforce converted into problem solvers. That experience so changed my perspective that I have done nothing else really since that time period except pursue this work. But I've realized since then that my first one was still the best I've seen, I think, in many ways, in terms of the thoroughness of the change. They had a lot to lose, so they probably, there was nothing sacred. They changed whatever had to be changed and shifted to a new page. But it certainly got me interested in this idea of what does it mean to really involve everybody, to shift people who are just doing jobs defined by tasks and shifting them into part of how to make things better, higher quality, identifying problems, solving problems, and how to have a leadership function that does that. So that's really my burning platform behind this work. I have never tired of it in all this time. In terms of, I've also, it's been interesting. I've gone back to school recently. Interesting age to go back. I'm getting a doctorate basically in lean leadership. And as part of that, some of these learnings came from different things that came up in my studies that I continue to apply to my field. And it was like, oh, some of this is interesting. One thing I've noticed when I've been in classes and where there's discussions about different areas of social change, I've also realized I have passionate about the idea of having balance of power in the workplace. It's not about power in my mind. It's really more that I'd seen production people over the years are generally seen as less capable than people in leadership roles. Now, I'm not saying anybody here in this listening to this that that's true of you. I'm just saying I've seen this dynamic. And I realized in my 20s, I thought that didn't seem right to me. I knew there was all kinds of capability that was unseen, like a bit buried under the surface in people, that the idea is how do we really let that up to the surface and let that go? So I'm really passionate about continuous improvement is really about that. And so that's the issue has been from a social change that we'll be talking about is if in general, lean or continuous improvement believes people closest to the work might be certainly in the best place to see issues and change issues, we still generally will see organizations struggle with making that actionable. And this is part of transformational work. This would apply to other things as well, where you might see we're trying to get somewhere, but we're largely unaware of the dynamics that don't allow for the change, meaning paradigms, mental models, those kinds of things. That's a peek into what we're going to talk about next. So in general, when I think of my background, which is the backdrop to the work we're going to talk about today, I had, I think I was probably in my early 20s, if not my teen years, when I decided I really thought things from a leadership perspective should be flipped upside down. It seemed to me that there was a few people that seemed to have a lot of the authority and ability to decide things, make any changes. It was very obvious to me in my early working years that it was like people might make a suggestion, but only a few people evaluated the suggestion and made any decisions on what to do and how to do it. So I kept feeling like I knew that that wasn't probably the best way to do it, and kept having a sense that we needed to make it so people in leadership roles were truly supporting others in being able to actually enable change. So while we talk a ton about empowerment, I've spent my entire working career discussing the topic of empowerment. This is one of those things much easier said than done. And so we'll be talking today about some of what really is in the way, what are some of those obstacles, and what we might do about it. And the reason for that is as we get clear how to really identify those obstacles and move them, we're going to be at the very things that make continuous improvement not sustainable. So we're going right after that point. So what's the problem with transformations, as many of us might know? So based upon what? I just have one statistic up here at 70% of lean transformations fail. I hear that anywhere from 70, 75, up to as high as 90. I'm sure it's not news to many of you here that the idea is they fail. I think the idea that they fail then comes into question. Do you mean fail like, you know, it was a failure, or we got something done, but it didn't get to where you were thinking? So from my experience, it more likely means you did not get to the place you had intended. There might be good benefits, some things being done. The most common thing I see lately is people saying we have it in pockets. It's working well here or there. We're not getting good systemic application, but we have it in pockets. However, most of the strategies that we're interested in implementing don't sound like that. They don't look like we'd like what we want to do done in pockets. So I just want to be clear, this idea of failure is not exactly an absolute term. It's a general term. But what I would say is I very rarely, and I mean rarely, have seen lean transformations hit the targeted state they were looking for. And whether you called it, again, Six Sigma, OpEx, or whatever, I've not seen continuous improvement initiatives hit their desired level of application. So what happens when these things don't work? Which again, I'm currently even in working in an environment, and this would be their maybe fourth definite attempt to, we're going to give it the old try, and we're going to, really do some problem solving and, make sure our daily boards work, and there's a whole fresh attempt. However, every time there's been a failure, people disengage, they become more resistant, less interested. Meaning from their point of view, it could be I'm giving you my heart, my soul, my ideas, my interest. And every time it fails, meaning we stop focusing on it, like we've had problem solving initiatives and the changes don't hold, all of that creates disengagement. Not just about that particular topic, but in general. And I'm sure many of you have those same stories of seeing when things kind of start and then don't quite sustain, how much damage it does to people's willingness to try again the next time. Also, the problem is that, and I was partly alluding to this earlier, improvement is rooted in the idea that it's involvement for everyone. However, I continue to see organizations very active in the idea of continuous improvement, and yet this idea of involving everyone is difficult on many levels. How would we do it? What does it require? Are we prepared to make the changes we would need to make to have that happen? So while we know that's the ideal, I more often than not see a very significant gap between involvement of everyone and the continuous improvement initiatives that we're looking at. The thing about this gap, and the more I've been studying it, is it's oftentimes not a stated gap. It's meaning there's a sense we believe in continuous improvement and we have an operating system and we're doing these things and it's in place, and yet it's there's many areas it's not, and yet there's generally not a discussion about that, or it's not an overt conversation. So we're going to be talking today, what would cause that? But I definitely think that's an interesting piece to pay attention to if there's a difference between the stated ideal and what's true. And last but not least, which has been partly some of my work, is I've also never seen it be helpful that the human resource function, the people function, is also either not involved. If they are involved, they're not usually towards the forefront of understanding what's changing, what needs to change to support that, and is everything lined up heading in one direction. So we're not going to go through a ton on that today, but that is certainly part of it. So that's a bit about the problem. And the good news is we're going to move on to what there is to do about it. So when I first think of the first thing we need to be considering is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term ready, fire, ready, aim, fire. Instead, what we more often see is fire, ready, aim. And so when it comes to these launches of strategies or initiatives, including continuous improvement, a lot of times we're going to take some steps, we're going to get the training or get someone hired or do some things. So that's the fire part, the energies starts. Then there's a sense of like, do we have everything we need after we're out of the gate? And then there's an idea about what I think about the aim part, that's the reflecting and making decisions about where I plan to go and how do I exactly plan to get there. So one overarching issue that I think all of us need to maybe consider more, how much of our efforts start off with a lot of reflection and planning, like what goes into aim? Meaning, have we really thought through where we start? What are all the considerations? What are the likely barriers? What's all going to be needed? Where are we going to get stuck in the mud? What are we going to do about that? So basically, I'm a proponent of spend a whole lot more time getting ready and getting clear about your aim and then fire. And there's so much front end work that needs to happen. And we'll be talking about what that might look like. That's one of the major differences, I think, between current levels of sustainability and a significant shift. And I'll talk about some successes I've seen, has been a whole lot more front end work before any of the action has started. It's really getting more clear ahead of time. So if we know better, why don't we do better? Because again, I spend most of my time talking with people with continuous improvement backgrounds of 10, 20, 30 years. And so you'd have to say, after all the years of working in this field, why are we getting stuck in the same places so often? And I think one of the things is we're often too close to a situation. We're in the situation. So how to look at it more objectively, where are we on track and off track is hard when you're actually in the forest. So we want to be thinking about how can we step back and see the forest and not just be in it. So we're going to talk next about this idea of system thinking applied to sustainable improvement transformations. Early in my both education and working career, I became familiar with Peter Senge's work in the fifth discipline. And it was quite a while ago. And I had literally spent 3 years doing nothing but this type of work. And then there's been a big gap. And then when it came back into my vision again about a year ago, I started to see things in a new way when it comes to the work I'd been doing in between the two time periods. The first time I learned system thinking, I was in an organization and we practiced these ideas that I'm about to share, and it made huge changes. It's a practice about being able to see the system dynamics of what's in front of you that you're living in, but it's a matter of like get up above it so you can see it as a system and see what flows, what's working and what doesn't. Now, the area about continuous improvement. So what I'm going to be sharing with you next is basically a system map of continuous improvement. Now, I'm going to share my map and you can develop your own. I don't think it's about the perfect map, but I do think that one of the issues that goes on in continuous improvement is we speak about the components like they're a list, like it's leader standard work and daily management and problem solving. It's like these separate elements as if they exist independently of each other. Gemba walks, all these different pieces. As I've been using the system mapping, I've been having much like a lot of lights going off for people. And all it is like hooking the ideas together. How do they connect? What drives what? And what are those outcomes? So let's take a look at this. So a typical plan might look like for continuous improvement is it might start. So first of all, we don't think about what from a continuous improvement operating system, where does it start? Well, it starts with, let's say, now this was a particular team. They said, well, it starts with the production work. So we do the work, we make the stuff. And from there, it kicks off this different kinds of issues. So you might have a different starting place. But what the importance of these different kinds of issues, when we think about problem solving, which is one of the cornerstones of all continuous improvement, is problem solving, is there's not one flow of it. It's like once we have types of problems, they tend to have different people, protocols, cadences for how those problems are addressed. So we want to be able to pull those apart. And it starts with something happens and it kicks out the defect, the something. So on a people issue, it could be turnover. Like we've hired someone and they didn't work out. They didn't have the right skills. And so they were terminated. That's a defect. So would be appropriate for problem solving. Productivity could mean we believe it should take this many time and resources to make so much, and we're not able to do that. And what are the major issues? And then we might do problem solving around those. If you were in healthcare, there would be a different application. Quality, again, whether you're being manufacturing or healthcare, might have different applications, but there'd be a whole thing about certain quality parameters not being on track to get to perfect quality. And last but not least is safety. So whether that's patient safety or person safety, there's usually whole other protocols and flows of how that goes. But what's similar, these are all problem identification. So it's really starting to get clear, where does it all start? And what kinds of problems are getting kicked out from there. Now, the next piece is that I haven't seen people have clearly in their mind is the use of visual management or the daily boards or Gemba walks about being the placeholder to see where these are at. What we know is if it's invisible, like it's all buried, it's either not put anywhere or you can't have any visibility to this. It's hard to get a sense of what's happening. So a lot of organizations with more effective operating systems have a very clear way that as systems are identified, they're going to show up in some visible way that if I walk through an area, I can see them. Not counts, not just like we had 4 incidents. It's like, what are the incidents? So I can get a sense of visibly what's happening. From there, as we know what problems have been identified, now we know what the canvas has got on it. We're going to be doing this, whether you call root cause analysis, A3 problem solving, kata-based improvement, whatever that is. We know that as a problem is then identified, it goes into some stage of some level of analysis. This could mean like we got a lot of little ones all bunched up till we have like an 80-20 or a Pareto analysis that says, here's the thing we're going to go after with problem solving. Or it could be serious ones all have their own. So there's going to be protocols that you decide which of all the identified problems get analysis and how does that function. But we do know that we need those pieces to happen. That the problem is identified and then there's some work on it in some cadence. From there, we've now done this problem solving and we've said, okay, at the end of the day, we think these are the improvements that we should be making. So we now have analysis and we have here's the plan for what we think we should change. Now, the next most important thing is the back end of this, which is things like standard improvements. So it's being clear all the different kinds of continuous improvement that tie out to how do we basically lock in the better way to do something. So whether this was a people issue, quality, safety, product, it doesn't matter. In the end, we know problems were defects, anything less than the desired state happens, we analyze it, and then whatever that improvement is has got to get locked and loaded, I call it. It means controlled, put into a controlled state, using a DMAIC term. Here, from my many years, and I would be surprised many of you with experience say this is really where a lot of problem solving all drops off. There's a lot of energy getting the problems, identified sometimes and then solved, but making sure whatever those improvements are hold. I was just in a meeting yesterday and they said, well, we fixed this a couple of years ago, but in the meantime, we have new supervisors and a lot of new people. Nobody was there for that change. So they're having the same old problem again. So again, it's not sustaining because at the time they wouldn't have begun to have the controls in place to hold that change. So when we look at our system, we want to be thinking how critical it's going to be that improvements can be standardized. Now, depending upon your industry, you might say we have a lot of standards. Some industries don't, or different organizations don't. But to the degree standards are in place or not in place is going to be a critical component of sustainability. There also goes to be quite a bit to get them all in place. Every time something changes, that change is made in that standard, and then everybody's trained to that way to make it likely that any change would be sustained over time. So just even having a whole set of problem solving around how sustainable are the improvements we identify in about anything. I always say, don't worry whether you can do 100. If you can't do one, we don't have to worry whether we can do 100. So if we have one safety improvement and you look at how sustainable is that change is a good place to get a sense of how solid are your systems around changing any of the standards after that. Now, at the end of that ball game, you're going to get this improved output. So you're going to get improved safety, less accidents, improved proactiveness, quality, same thing. All those metrics will improve. We'll have reduced turnover, improved absenteeism. All those metrics change, but only to this degree that this system is working and able to make basically cycles of learning to get to the end. Now, the last component in this drawing, so this is just one drawing. It's not the drawing, it's a drawing, is how leader standard work ties into it. So we say what we're going to need leaders using something like a leader standard work, like meaning some kind of a checklist, to be looking at problem identification, checking in on the analysis. Again, do I have evidence things are moving? And if there's new standards to change, am I checking that? The idea here is you're looking at more the current flow and checking in on it. Now, that's just a few things, leader standard work checks. But the idea is, again, groups that we're seeing them wrestle with is they go to do leader standard work and there's confusing how it ties in. Like, while all of this is going on in a building, it's not visible to the mind's eye of what these flows are, who's involved, what are the systems, the flow of information, and how can my leader standard work help me keep track of things. Part of it is leader standard work often early on is like, what am I doing every day? And then it's kind of associated with good use of time and discipline to repeat things. That's all true. That's all good. In the end, it's a critical piece to be monitoring this system. Are the things that should be happening, and how does my leader standard work keep me on track to check these things so that it's not like they stopped happening and nobody knew it because nobody's checking it. And what we know is it's almost like through inertia, we know it's designed to almost fade away. We have to be doing things that actually hang on to things and hold on to them. So this kind of diagram, what I would say is, so it's a very standard system map, not like process mapping, not like value stream mapping. This is based upon the work of Peter Senge out of the fifth discipline. And I have his information, I think, towards the end on the citation. I have found this is a great way to have the teams you're working with or that you're in start to draw it for themselves. So we have all these improvement tools and methodologies. Let's map them. How do they hook to each other? That's the missing component, one critical missing component. We're not really getting clear how all these things tie out and how they support each other, the rhythms they create. So this is a diagram, but we know with all value stream mapping, same way. You can have the perfect map. That's not really the question. It's how all the team has an understanding in their minds about how everything hooks together. So that's a big, important tool. Happy to share more information after. Happy to share this with you. All right. The next thing out of using system thinking is something we call a vicious cycle. And what that means is it's a negative reinforcing cycle that the more one thing happens, the more this other negative thing happens, which makes more the first thing happen. And those are called vicious cycles. Examples in continuous improvement. So if we want to talk about how do we live, if the forest, as we live in the forest, there's problems and we settle for short-term solutions. That is a very common vicious cycle. So for example, someone trips and falls, and so the response is be more careful. And even if they have the floor cleaned one extra time per week, it doesn't address why the person was scurrying across the floor due to a culture that does not prioritize safety, meaning it has a bigger root cause. They do this simple thing like, so they're doing their incident investigation, and in order to get it closed out, they write, oh, well, we're going to do these things. And, they're probably aware at the time this won't fix it, but there's kind of this pattern of we just settled for that. It's like, well, we did something. The idea of what would you do to fix the cultures probably seems too huge and hard to get your hands on about what would we really do so this wouldn't happen again for this person to trip and fall the way they did. So I want to talk to you, how does system diagramming help us understand that? So if problems were identified, so that's them starting here, and then we analyze them, and they can have a sustainable improvement, improved performance. That's a positive reinforcing cycle. So the more we see a problem, analyze it, make a change, and it holds up and performance actually improves, the more we're going to continue to identify problems. It doesn't mean whether problems do or do not happen more often. It's how often we're identifying them. So, however, the vicious cycle I just said was we have problems identified, and we have work that creates the problems. We either don't identify them, so we have unidentified problems, then we have a failure to learn or improve, and that makes the problem repeat, and hence work that we have more problems. So having unidentified problems and the problems continue is a negative reinforcing cycle, as well as identifying problems, analyzing problems, and improvements that don't sustain. Again, failure to learn and improve, and then heading up to identified problems. Heading around to problem repeats, that cycle. So there's two different negative cycles here and one positive. Again, this isn't a matter you can just hand this diagram to a team and they'll know, but it's them thinking through what does it look like when we have the person trip and fall and we analyze it and it doesn't sustain, then what happens? What happens if we do a better job in these things and things do sustain, although the upper reinforcement one is much harder than it looks. What we found when I've had teams look at this is they start becoming more clear. How are they settling for a lot of short-term solutions that don't last? They see how that is driving, it's reinforcing problems from existing. If they were to get some more experience and practice with getting things to sustain, it would create a reinforcing cycle of getting better at that process. So basically, one reinforces one and one reinforces the other. The question to ask yourselves, which is more likely happening, and how could you use a tool like this? First of all, there's many places to learn how to draw this kind of system diagrams. When I first learned this a long, long time ago, it wasn't as common. There's many ways to do this, but the idea is, how do we just, instead of continue to have that next meeting to go do that next investigation and rattle off what we need to do and put it to bed, how do we start to see that for what it really is? All right. Last thing out of systems thinking. So that's my second system thinking. This is the third. What do lily ponds have to do with it? So you might be like, what does that have to do anything? What's the thing about a lily pond? So this is an example of a lily pond. So some of you might have ever heard the story about how when the lily pond doubles, when it first doubles and we go from 1 to 2, most of the pond is empty and there's just a few lily ponds. Then when we go from 2 to 4, there's now 4 lily ponds, and still most of the pond is all water on top and just a few. But every time it doubles until by the time it's half full, and then it doubles, it goes from half full to full. So it means it's like a hockey stick. about how things improve. So the idea of continuous improvement actually is like a lily pond. But here's the piece that we want to think about from a systems thinking, coming up above it to see what's happening. What I've seen happen for many years, and many of you, my guess, might have had a similar experience, is as we go to do continuous improvement. So let's say we're going to put everyone through problem solving training. And as they start to do that, we might expect, we have teams going through problem solving, and the expected improvement is that diagonal line from the left to the right. We expect to see, as they're trained, we'll see somehow an equal output of like improvement. So more skills, more improvement. We think it's kind of an equal relationship. In fact, here is really what you're likely looking at, which reminds you of a lily pond, is at first almost nothing's happening because the skills are very new, the amount of improvement, that ability to complete that cycle, to identify a problem, analyze a problem, standardize the solution, and hang on to it is not built yet. What happens though is as the efforts get started, like we're going to give it the old, the old try, and we're getting all these people trained and some extra coaching and full-time people brought in to help. When that gap shows up between how much investment in time and energy and not that much output, a lot of times that's where people give up. That's why we have a lot of initiatives get to a place and stop. And I'm always like, the more I've watched it, I'm like, you were right in the place you needed to double down. You needed to double your effort instead of pull back. But the reason is, I think there's not a clarity with really what it would take to build something like a problem solving skill set in a sustainable way to get the kind of eventual problem solving output you'd get with robust identification, robust analysis, and standards that are well implemented. And when you make a change, that change is registered and people are trained to it and it holds. That's a big ask and it takes a lot of practice. But the good news would be if you can get on the other end of that hockey stick, look how fast you could go places you'll never get any other way until you really go the distance to build in that skill set. So what I think is interesting from a system way of looking at things is if we could see where we're getting stuck by having an unreasonable expectation about how things work, then when we're in that place we'd expect to be, like we've put in the time, it's nothing shows yet, we'd be like, we're expecting that. And then we might make a different choice. So this is just an example of how the lily pond works. Senior leaders expect to see steadily improving results. They see slow progress. Stakeholders become impatient, and so then they pull back and they maybe walk away. All right, so that's it on the system thinking. Again, maybe some of those ideas, there's plenty out there on the use of system thinking workshops you could do, different ways to have your team use different concepts in system thinking to look at your improvement initiatives. Next, I want to mention another piece of the work that I've gotten a lot of mileage from in the last several years to improve sustainability is built right here in the shingle model. Some of you may be aware of it, some not. I see a lot of continuous improvement people have seen the model, but they're not at a glance very clear what's in this model that you might not have learned in general continuous improvement. I would say it's right kind of in front of you. It's in the way the diamond works. You see the word results, and then you see culture, which is basically behaviors, and then we see systems. And the idea of the model that I think is the most broad application to anybody working on continuous improvement transformations is this simple formula here. There's many more. There's enablers and there's principles. There's more pieces to this model. But this idea alone is if your continuous improvement effort, the transformation is designed to get a certain kind of result, right? So the more clear we are what that is we want to see, improved quality, better patient satisfaction, whatever those results are. The next piece about getting clear what the behaviors are that drive that is a big piece of work a lot of times. We're really not clear what behaviors are going to be needed to drive that improved output. So I want to be asking, how clear are we? But the big piece that Shingo speaks to is the systems that must then be in place to drive that particular behavior to get that result. And there's much in this work around what's a meaning a successful system that drives a behavior is one that is got an owner, has a good cycle of cadence. Like you know that that system drives will target that behavior and in a sustainable way. So a lot of times what I've seen is organizations who are not sustaining in a major, like they're putting in a lot of energy that isn't really quite landing. You'll see a lack of systems. One, usually a lack of clarity, what results are, what the behaviors are. And then we'll see systems either not in place or not strong enough to drive those behaviors to get the results. Sounds like a mouthful. Here's what I'd say is that one simple formula, so to speak, of systems drive behaviors drives results is a major piece to getting sustainability. So there's huge application of that. And it doesn't necessarily mean you need to say we've put in a model or we have to go down some whole new path. It's starting to look at the work you're doing, the approaches you're taking, and asking those questions. What are the results we're looking for that we're not getting? What behaviors do we need? And then really looking at what systems. An example of this might be like we want people to get feedback from their leaders so they have a sense of growth in their role. So the result would be people are getting quality feedback that leaves them feeling enriched and engaged and like anxious to grow and develop in their roles. That behavior from a leader perspective would be this high quality approach to coaching and feedback. Those would be those kinds of behaviors. You want to get that really clear what that looks like. The systems would be development systems and feedback systems that drive all that. Whatever your current output is a function of those things. It's mostly whatever system you've got. We always say you're getting the results your systems were designed to give you. That's what you're getting. If you want to change the result, it's really getting clear, has that system been redesigned sufficiently to get me there? So when I'm seeing organizations really want to stop chasing their tail and we really want to make things sustain, this formula has been a critical place. There's much written and known about what makes for robust systems. Not actually, much of it might even seem like common sense. Where we get in our way is we're participating in these things not being on track as if we're not sure where it's not on track. And usually it's somewhere in this formula. So the questions you'd want to ask yourself is what results do I want to see? What behaviors are needed? And what robust systems are in place to drive these behaviors? All right, so getting to sustainability. I'm going to be giving you a 4-part model that you can use. And this is the work of David Stroh out of Social Systems for Change as applied to lean transformations. And I found this work really illuminating to me about how this idea of how it's basically where we stuck in the mental models. Where is it the way we think is why we're not sustaining? We're it's already happening in the way of our mindsets before it's a matter of the initiatives don't work, like the training didn't work or the problem solving approach doesn't work. It's actually we're stuck in the way we think. So I'm going to go through these 4 stages of change, and I've had some great success in seeing organizations step back from the initiatives, the work, the busyness of it all, and getting clear. How do we kind of get ahead of this better to set ourselves up for success in more sustainable work? So it starts with this idea of becoming ready for change. So wherever I'm at, if we want better problem solving or better quality, whatever those things are, we have to assess how ready am I? Not just myself individually, but us as a team or as an organization, how ready are we? I'm going to talk a minute about then how do we then identify the current state? It speaks to how do we make a choice between we could change or not change, and how do we make an educated decision about that? That changing from a mindset point of view requires a choice to think differently. And then in the end, we close that gap. Here's citations here at the bottom. So what does change readiness look like? So I don't know if any of you here have ever seen something called an iceberg, but I'm going to go through that in a minute. That's understanding if change, especially continuous improvement, is happening at a visible level where we can see we're doing the Gemba walks, we're doing the daily boards, or we're having problem solving training. That's what's on the surface. An iceberg is about what's under the surface, that what we see up here is all driven by things that were not visible to the eye. Fundamentally, what you're hearing me speak to today is we need to become more aware of what's not meeting the eye, what's driving behavior and mindsets that needs to shift to get a better outcome. We're going to talk a bit about you're going to need to make sure there's a sense of a shared vision. So how solid is that work? And then there's a sense of a creative tension to head in a direction. So how clear is we're heading somewhere and there's a tension moving us towards that improved state. A lot of times what you might see is it's either a missing vision or it's unclear. Some have it, some don't. Maybe this group's got it really strong. It's missing elsewhere. And there's also a sense like maybe we're not clear what that road looks like to get over there. This iceberg, here's first of all, there's many examples of icebergs. So this is not a Cheryl iceberg. This is more or less any common iceberg. The idea is up in the top, we might see the lack of sustainability. So we had started to do things, either make a change that doesn't hold up or the whole initiative isn't holding up. So that's what you see at the top. That's the ice on top. Then we might start to see some of the things that led to that and where the events are that you can see those things starting or stopping, like we stopped doing the problem solving training, or we might have made a change to how a standard is, how you do a certain piece of work and it stops. But underneath there, you're going to see patterns. A pattern would be, it's a way we generally operate. Like we're not aware, we don't make these decisions like all by themselves, right? There's a pattern of how we operate. We make choices in patterns. So are we aware of the patterns? I just mentioned problems aren't really solved. We agree with short-term solutions that we know won't fix it in the long run. That's a pattern. Now, structures, those have to do with things that institutionalize the pattern. And we just talked about behavior, systems drive behaviors. These are systems, structures, those are very similar. What are the systems that are in place or not in place that are driving those patterns that get that output? And then last but not least, it's really our thought patterns. A lot of things that drive our systems have to do with how we think about things. So the conversation I'd like to see us having more of the time is when we go to do continuous improvement or we want something to sustain, whether it's the improvements or the work, how do we understand our thinking around this that could be getting in the way, and how do we address that? Now, stage 2 has to do with really getting clear where you are. Where are we today? So the reason I bring this up, I realized as I went back through learning this, or didn't learn it for the first time, learned it for the second time, is I think there's a propensity to approach continuous improvement like, let's just make the change, right? This is bad, this is better, let's do that. The issue is, whatever you currently have, there's all kinds of reasons why you have that. There's all kinds of thinking and mental models that drive the current state. So if we don't pause long enough to get clear why we have what we have, for many reasons that probably are striking people as good reasons, we don't have to be surprised in the end if we don't make the change, because we haven't really established what was anchoring in the current state anyway. So I think it's getting clear, like a lot of these things, we think they're obvious improvements and they may or may not be. The current state has very clear anchors in thinking and reasoning as to why it is that way. So common ones I've heard are, I'm too busy to reflect on why things don't work. Like, I'm going to have all I can do to get the continuous improvement of the problem solving put in, or to do the A3 work I'm going to need to get done. I don't have time to stop and just think about why we're at where we're at. I have seen, and I'm sure many would agree, we have a tendency to believe action and assertion equates to results. I think given the amount of time and energy that has gone into continuous improvement over 75 years, shows us you can work really hard and absolutely nothing change. So this idea that we're under the gun and don't have time is really that's an example of it's a mental model. When, if you thought about it, if we don't reflect more, then we can't see that barrier before we're going to hit it or understand where we're hitting them already. So that's a common, I think, thought pattern that keeps us stuck. So, in terms of, okay, what would you do about this? If you're thinking about wherever you're at and you're not sustaining the way you want to be, you would start interviewing people and you would talk to people, and could be you or other people, or listening carefully to what's driving that current condition. And you're starting to identify the patterns. That is where you're all going to get stuck. So you're thinking through that iceberg. We're like, let's get a good handle on this iceberg, because our current state is being driven off that iceberg. Whatever is up at the top was driven about everything on the bottom. So what I'm proposing is, before we move into action or more action or fixing things, is let's understand what drives the current state. The third stage that this work is like, when I finally heard it, I'm like, oh, that makes complete sense. We want to consider the pros and cons of the change. And many of the times I've always thought, it was like, of course it'll be better if everybody's a problem solver. Of course. Truth is, there's pros and cons. And when we don't discuss the real argument against it, it just hits us. It shows up. We just haven't made any room to have that conversation, which means maybe now doesn't feel like the right time to make the change, or there really are reasons why this wouldn't be the right time or place of how to put in whatever strategy it is. So it's hard to make a choice to deal with the negative aspects of something if we haven't made a choice. Like, we haven't looked the whole thing over and said, here's good reason to do it, here's good reasons not. Either way, there'll be some drawbacks, and I want to understand those and then make a choice. So this idea of making a conscious choice, a fully informed conscious choice, which again would be have come out of some of that reflection work, and really getting clear what changes would need to be made to get to the next place. This goes back to that lily pond in a way. I think if we're being short-sighted in what it requires to make a change, then when it's hard, it's too hard and we walk away. Instead of, no, we knew it would be hard. We knew it would look like no progress, very little progress. And now that I understand that, I might make a different choice. So this is really about understanding the parameters and making clear choices. And then don't squelch lack of agreement. I mean, one thing I've learned the hard way, having the naysayers be quiet doesn't really work. So we want to make sure we're addressing that. The last stage is increasing awareness. Basically, we want to change that iceberg. So we want to make sure people understand the systems, change the dynamics of the systems, shift their mental models, and create a new iceberg. So that is fundamentally where you're heading. So as we get ready to close, and I think there was a couple questions, is the work of the core program that mentioned this is a system, basically. It's a human behavior system that speaks to every time we want a behavior change to do anything different, we need to have a system around behavior change. Now, this book that I wrote called Let Go to Lead, which is not an expensive book, buy it, don't buy it. It's okay either way, but I'm just letting you know we're like, where is this? It's in a book. It speaks to how we need to get clear what behavior change looks like in terms of setup has to do with vision. Am I clear why I'm doing what I'm doing? Am I clear what behavior I'm changing? So a lot of times there's a bunch of things not on track with clarity there. Then we have the training, the coaching, the feedback, and the recognition. But my point is, all behavior change requires quite a bit of supports. And when we don't have a sense of that, that by itself can be a problem. So you might want to think about how this performance cycle, your own organizations may have a similar cycle. So I'm not saying it's got to be this cycle, but the idea is we want to understand behavior change really well. Another thing in this work, I guess I would say in reflection, begin with the end in mind on a lot of things, like what's my end game? Consider what I'm going to need, especially using that performance cycle. What will all need to be changing in the behaviors to get there? And then I'm reflecting on how ready we are to make those change, and do we have those right systems in place? So those, when you're thinking about what your next couple of steps might be, it might very well be in this area. And with that, here's a bit of my bio back here, just in terms of my background. Do we have any questions? Oh, thank you. I had one question that was turned in. What are the most common pitfalls when it comes to continuous improvement? Um, and I would have to say, so I'm assuming that might mean we've made a change and we've done some problem solving and we've said we're going to do something a new way. What are the common pitfalls by why that doesn't sustain? One, I've mentioned the controls aren't in place. There's nothing there to hold that new thing, that new way, that is strong enough that we would know over time, different people, different leaders, different people doing the work would be likely to be getting that new, better way in place. So that right there is where a lot of them all, I would say, again, in general, the way I think of it, that performance cycle, going back to here, it's the lesson here is not whether you do some of these things, is that usually when it doesn't sustain, there aren't enough of them being done consistently enough and cohesively enough to get you there. So it's not enough. All right, so that was one of the questions. I got some drinks. So where you were doing, oh, where I'm getting my doctorate
Oh,
from.
yep. Okay, go ahead.
I'm getting my doctorate from Fielding Graduate University. It's very fun. I have to say it's the funnest thing I've done in a long time. I love it. And am learning, first of all, there's much research in the area of lean leadership and lean and continuous improvement. So it's been really enjoyable to do that. Hope this was helpful. Happy to share more if anybody wants to reach out with questions. Would be happy to share what I've been learning. And I'm also busy studying a lot. So if anybody's wants to ever reach out and have me use, I'm always looking for workplaces that I'll be using to study from. So thank you for that.
Cheryl, thank you so much. I do
Yeah.
believe that was all the questions. So thank you for that as well. Thank you to everybody who attended live today. We will see you soon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.